All right. Last week we finished up chapter 6, uh, and we just got into chapter 7. Uh, Next week, my understanding is Brian will be back to take up where we leave off today. And so, anyway, we didn't get all that much done in chapter 7 last week, so I kind of want to review a little bit. So, if you have both your Bibles and your book on by Brother May, turn to page 65. Providence and government. You know, we used to say when I was stationed at headquarters Marine Corps, and we go places, we introduce ourselves and say, "Hi, I'm Major Gentry. I'm from headquarters Marine Corps. I'm here to help." What a joke that was. Usually, it was to find issues and things like that. But our government, we can love it or we can hate it at times, and there's just so many variations going on at times. He starts out in the book, we'll just read the first couple of comments. It says, Christians comment on the world scene, usually denoting the decline of morality, the loss of respect for Christianity and the Bible in America, and the rising Muslim menace worldwide. We often say, remember, God is in control. That is certainly true. The Bible affirms that, right? However, it's important to examine Scripture and ask, what does it mean to say God is in control? And to what extent does God involve himself in the affairs of earthly kings and their rulers? I mean, look what's going on in the world right now, especially in Iran. We had to give them a love tap, according to President Trump here just the other day, because they were violating the agreement. So I asked the question last week, why does God allow bad things to happen? You remember what we said? Well, there's three basic principles. And that's in the middle of the book here on 65. Three basic principles of God's dealings with his creation are applicable to these questions. And number one, God made us free will creatures, able to obey him or rebel against him. And he does not violate mankind's free will. Although human beings, number two, can act in sinful ways contrary to the express moral will of God, they cannot, no matter what they do. And number one, God made us free will or stop, able to obey him or rebel against ultimate will. And he does. And then number three, choices that go contrary to God's express moral will carry consequences. God is not mocked. Wherever people sow, they will also reap. You know, when I was teaching school full time, first day of school, you always go through the classroom rules and stuff like that. And, classroom rules and school rules come in a book about this thick. And what I would do, I would write on the board my school rule. I had one rule. You go, what? One rule? I write on the board, I expect students to do what's right. And then that word right was an acronym. R stood for respect others. I was to have integrity or honesty at all times. G was to give it your best effort. And that might not be 100% every day, because sometimes we can't give 100% every day. But give it your best effort that day. H was to have high goals. So many times kids settled for being just mediocre. Have high goals. And then the last one, and one maybe the important one, or they're all important, but T is to take responsibilities for your actions. For everything you do, there's going to be consequences, both good and bad. And why does God allow bad things to happen? Well, remember, we talked about the Bible teaches that God created a what kind of a world? A good world, right? Genesis 1:31. But human sin introduced suffering and evil, as seen in Genesis 3:16 through 19. Also, God's sovereignty means he permits even good and bad to fulfill his broader purposes according to Romans 8:28. Remember we said that all things work together for good for those who love the Lord? Not some, but all. Suffering can serve as a means for spiritual growth. and reliance on God is illustrated in James 1, 2 through 4. Remember, he starts out by saying, consider it all joy when you fall into different trials and tribulations. That's kind of a hard one to do sometimes, huh? The Bible does not attribute all bad events directly to God, but often to human choices or spiritual forces like Satan. We saw that in Job, right? God's allowance of suffering does not negate his love. He sent Jesus to this earth to redeem humanity from evil consequences. John 3:16, for God so loved the world. And Christians believe God will ultimately, in the end, he'll end all suffering and restore creation as promised in Revelation 21 and 4, where it says, there will be no more tears, no more pain, no more sorrow. Comments, thoughts on that? We see here that God is not to be mocked. Wherever people sow, they will also reap. We see that in Galatians 6 and 7. And this includes kings and presidents and nations that follow. Those who sow to the flesh by rebelling against God will reap disaster and corruption. The wise man Solomon's words are still true. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. You know, I also had you write down or look at Daniel 2 and 21. And I have a number of different translations here. Just share with you a little bit. I like how the New Living Translation says it. It says, he controls the course of world events. He removes kings and sets up other kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the scholars. The ESV version says, he changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. And the rest of the translations are very close and similar in nature to the one I just read. But it's important that we understand that. Any comments on the kind of the opening dialogue? Yes, Jack. Right. Absolutely. Can happen to us for sure. Good comment. Yes. Right. Purifying. Test. Yeah. That's right. Testing produces what? Patience, endurance. Got to keep on keeping on no matter what. Yeah. Good comments. Good. Any others? All right. Let's turn the page. Nations in charge. Top of it, Brother May says this: the inspired apostle, this would be Paul, commanded Christians concerning government rulers. Romans 13 and 1, it says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. What does Paul mean here when he says that in Romans 13:1? Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Good example, good point. Yeah. Other thoughts, Mark. Right. Yeah. Yeah. We're going to have the answer to that when rulers tell us something it goes against God's will. Yes, John. Mm-hmm. Charmin, right, Jack? Yeah. Yeah. Well, right now the big thing seems to be the pushing and pushing and pushing of socialism. I mean, look at the elections right in New York City just past few days. Socialism has never, ever worked in any country at any time. I mean, I don't want to badmouth old Bernie, but he's got millions and millions of dollars. You know, socialism does not work. Capitalism. That's right. That's right. Cuba, same problem. Venezuela, all those. I wrote down here for that first verse, 13, verse 1. It teaches that all government authorities are established by God, and believers are called to submit them as part of honoring God's sovereignty. Okay? Then he goes on to say, reading from the book here, that paragraph, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Paul goes on to explain that governing authorities serve as God's instruments, right? To maintain what? Order, right? To punish the wrongdoing. And also on the good side, reward good behavior. It's going to sound like a silly question, and I'm going to ask you anyway. Why do we have, or why do we need rules to live by? Can you just imagine for a minute? Chaos, right? Yeah, to prevent chaos, to protect human life, promote social stability, which reflects ultimately God's providential design. God knew what he was doing, didn't he? Yeah. I go back to the Marine Corps for a minute. We were always taught that the key to success was good order and discipline. And I think that holds true today. Good order and discipline. Yes. Oh, yeah. It's disheartening. Mark. Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, if we could just follow the golden rule, right? But so many times people switch that around. Instead of doing to others as you have them do unto you, they go do it to others before they do it to you. You know, that does not work. Yeah. Other thoughts or comments? How about this? How about is it? It's important to understand that Paul's instruction here in Romans 13 is not blind obedience. Okay. What? Read with me here in the middle of page 66, where it starts out. Although God may on occasion providentially influence who becomes a ruler in a particular instance, Romans 13 probably means more generally that God has ordained that there should be earthly rulers that than that he himself appoints particular rulers. Although Romans 13 expresses a truth concerning rulers, it does not express the whole truth. Rulers, and we've kind of got into this a little bit, sometimes forbid what Jesus has commanded and may command what the Lord forbids. In such cases, we learn from the example of the apostles Peter and John that we must obey who? God rather than man. Right? God rather than man. Comments, thoughts? That's right. Yeah. China is one of them. Iran. Yeah. Yeah. I can't figure out Iran. All right. Let's look at this next paragraph because we're not alone in our thinking here. The prophet Habakkuk wrestled with this theme. He marveled that God allowed his people, Israel, to continue being so wicked so long. And he asked his questions. Oh Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence and you will not save? This is in Habakkuk 1 and 2. Then Habakkuk goes on to explain, why do you make me see iniquity? And why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Do you ever feel that way today? Oh, all the time, I'm afraid to say. You turn on the news, what you were talking about, and it's nothing but violence. It's amazing. Um, I don't know. How do people deal with it? Not sure. Look at how God responds to Habakkuk. This is at the page, top of page 67. It says, God responded to the prophet by saying he would rise up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, and use them to punish his people for their sins. We see that all throughout the Bible, right? Look among the nations and see, wonder, and be astounded. Some translations say be astonished. For I am doing work in your days that you would not even believe if told. For behold, I am rising up the Chaldeans, that bitter, hasty nation. They were mean, ruthless, who marched through the breadth of the earth, seized dwellings and not their own. You see that later on in Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 5 through 6. Now, clearly, he said, I am doing work in your days, and I am rising up the Chaldeans. The problem is, yes, go ahead, Ron. Right. But and I agree with you on that. I see a change coming to America. Yeah. The pendulum is starting to swing back the other way. Jason talked about this, that sports guys, heroes, great players in all sports. When they win or do something good, they give credit to where credit belongs to, and that's God. You know, Um we see more people turning to God for answers because I think it's finally hitting them square between the eyes that what we're doing is not working. It's not the road we want to go down, John. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. What's that saying? When good men do nothing, evil abounds. And we see that it's such a true statement. Yeah. Other thoughts or comments? Um, it's interesting how God responds here. When God told him about the Chaldeans and what was going to happen, uh, this troubled Habakkuk even more. He's going, "You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and are silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he?" Habakkuk 1 and 13. So God said he would then rise up another nation to punish the Babylon for their sins. See, at this point, Habakkuk kind of says, "Okay, I give up." Uh, he gave up trying to make human sense of God's divine ways. And as we do sometimes, right? What does Isaiah 55, 8, 9 say? Do you remember? For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. For as the heavens, or declares the Lord, for as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. We sometimes we can't as human beings put ourselves on the same level as God and what He does. God has His plan from the very beginning. Now, those people He uses to punish, if you will, uh, the people, Assyria rose up and punished the Babylonians. So it all flows together. Um, Bottom of page 67, next to the last paragraph says, "We must trust God even when we do not understand what He is doing." Here is what I said. Assyria preceded Babylon as a world empire. And just as God used Babylon to punish Judah, He used Assyria to punish the northern kings of Israel. The Lord called Assyria the rod of my anger. He uses nations to control other nations. That naturally raises the same question Habakkuk asked. How could Assyria have been used to punish Israel when Assyria was guilty of even greater evil and violence than Israel? Part of the answer to that, God used Babylon to punish Syria and then used the Medes and Persians to punish Babylon. And again, this truth is reaffirmed. Nations' actions, and this is important, nations' actions contrary to God's express moral will, even when it is used to accomplish God's ultimate purposes, top of page 68 now, still carry consequences. Again, everything has consequences, some good, some bad. And then he kind of repeats what Galatians 6, 7, 8 say. What nations sow, they also will reap. Any thoughts on that, Jack? That's right. That's exactly right. In fulfillment of the prophecy, why do nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The king of earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed ones. Pilate, okay, Herod conspired with the Roman nations and the Jews to try to stop God from establishing his kingdom and enthroning his son as king. We know how that turned out. Roland. Right, right. Yeah, agree, 100%. Um, there in the middle of page 68 says the Jewish leaders acted out of envy. Pilate acted out of political expediency, fearful of of angering Caesar. Peter said the mob crucified and killed Jesus by the hands of the lawless men. Although their motives were evil and their actions wicked, what they did was according to the definite plan, and this is hard to sometimes grasp, and foreknowledge of God. Their sinful actions would accomplish God's ultimate plan to offer his son for the sins of the world. And then I have highlighted here, as previously noted, although human beings include kings and presidents, including kings and presidents, can act in sinful ways contrary to the express moral will of God, here again, they cannot prevent God's ultimate will from being accomplished. They may even unwittingly assist in it. I think that's kind of funny. That happens. Yeah. You know, there's been many a preacher who has said, we're talking about going back to America and the state we're in today. Many a preacher has said if God doesn't do something to punish America, he's going to have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember? They couldn't even find how many people? 10 people. 10 righteous people. God was, Abraham was negotiating back and forth. Couldn't find that. Very interesting. Any thoughts on that sections about nations? Okay, we have a few minutes. Let's look at the conquering of nations. Um, Let me just start out here. The concept of this section, conquering nations, relates to how God works behind the scenes of human governments to achieve his purposes. Specifically, Brother May here explores these three core ideas. God rules over the nations. He emphasizes that God is sovereign over all earthly kingdoms, rising up or bringing down rulers and nations according to his divine will, even when the rulers themselves are unaware of his guiding hand. Number two, the secular powers as tools. And we see that throughout history, God has used conquering nations, sometimes pagan and wicked ones, as instrument to carry out his judgments or discipline his people. And the example we talked about is like the Assyrians or Babylonians in the Old Testament. Without God actively causing the sins committed by these conquerors, he doesn't cause them to sin. That's their own free will. And third is the ultimate kingdom. While earth empires rise and fall, Brother May here contrasts them with the unshakable kingdom of God. No matter who is conquering or ruling on earth, God's ultimate providential plan remains on track, moving towards the triumph of his eternal purposes. Any thoughts or comments on that? Well, let's look at what it says on page 68 at the bottom there. It says, besides using evil nations to punish the wicked of other nations, God also moved nations to bring about fulfillment of his benevolent promises. Remember, God promised Judah that they would return to the land from which they were exiled, and their beloved Jerusalem and the temple of God would be rebuilt. Isaiah promised, amazingly, even before the Babylonians had come to power, that the Medes and the Persians would conquer Babylon. See that in Isaiah 13. And the Persian king Cyrus, who Isaiah identified him by his name centuries before he was born, would let the captive peoples go home. Amazing. God called Cyrus my shepherd. And he says, and my anointed. Same word as the Hebrew word for Messiah and the Greek for Christ. Promising, he said, he shall fulfill all my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple, your foundation shall be laid. Pretty interesting when you think about that. Thoughts, comments so far? Okay. Uh, there at the top of page 69, 69, yeah. The inspired chronicler of Judah, Isaiah, also gave God credit for Cyrus's decree. You know, Cyrus said, we won't read the whole thing, but said, whoever is among you of all the people, may the Lord his God be with you. Let him go up. Gave him permission to leave. And then in the middle page, although God was using Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian empire to punish his people with 70 years of captivity, look what Nebuchadnezzar had happened. He got puffed up, didn't he? With pride. And God humiliated him by forcing him to eat grass like a beast of the field, until that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, gives it to whom he will. It's interesting. God is in control. It does not, however, answer all the questions about how and when. We just have to put faith in that. Powerful nations built empires by conquering neighboring nations. Okay, we see that through history. And often that was not very difficult when you think about it. The overall size and power and strength of the opposing uh, nation. The hard part, the greater difficulty lay in keeping conquered nations in submission and paying tribute while the empire builder was off conquering other nations. We know that Assyria and Babylon, they used terror to accomplish that. Thoughts? The rest of this section on conquering nations just goes into the details about the different, for example, on the top of page 70, the Persians decided to try a different method. They allowed the people that Babylon had driven to exile to go back to their homelands, rebuild their cities and temples. They even provided some monetary help, assistance. And although the captive people were still under Persian domination, they ruled them less brutally. There at the bottom of the middle of the page, it says, of that paragraph, we are not left to wonder, however, whether God's providential care for his people was at work in this case. God promised the Jews that they would return, and he described Cyrus centuries earlier as his anointed to accomplish the return. It's hard for us to really understand how God, from the very beginning, before any of us were here, the world was here, how God had this plan already laid out. It kind of blows your mind. Roland? That's right. Yeah. As I said, I see a swing, and I saw Geraldine nodding her head. I see a swing on the pendulum going back towards religious things, giving God the glory who it belongs to. Any other final thoughts? Well, we didn't get all the way through. Brian won't have much to finish up. I'll let him know where to pick up next week. But thank you so much for your kind attention.